welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out on this beastly cold day in the 30s, I believe it was this morning, so I'm still complaining about the winter. My name is Nicola Courtwright. I'm in the Department of Art and History of Art. I'm also chair of European Studies. And it's under that aegis that I joined together with the very kind folk in Hampshire to help sponsor this lecture by Paul Jaskot. It's also sponsored by the Amherst College Lamont Fund, our department in the Art and History of Art, European Studies, of course, the Department of the Architectural History program, Humanities and Cultural Studies, the program in European Studies, and the School of Critical Social Inquiry at Hampshire College. Whoa. Okay. So you're going to be engaging in critical social inquiry.
I think we will be.
Yeah. Really okay. So Paul Jaskot is, he received his BA at Swarthmore. Then he got his PhD at Northwestern with an unusual dissertation in architectural history called Architectural Policy of the SS. So that was unusual because nobody was really working on that kind of material before. And that yielded lately a book called Nazi Perpetrator, Post-War German Art and the Politics of the Right, which doesn't just include architectural history, but also paintings. Gerhard Richter is a part of the subject of that book. He wrote a book, The Architecture of Oppression. And then since 2007, he's been collaborating with Anne Kelly Knowles and others to create this really remarkable GIS database mapping all kinds of aspects of concentration camps and the architecture of the camps, among other things, going into archives, putting it into these databases, and then mapping in an extraordinary way with, I guess, is it big data? Are we calling this big data? Close. Yeah, it seems like really big data to me. And that led to a recent book called Holocaust Geographies. He's also now starting a new exciting project as the 2-year Andrew W. Mellon professor at the CASA, which is part of the Research Institute at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, which involves looking at a great deal of architecture built between 1914 and 24, am I right? Those are the 10 years. And actually mapping and studying those not famously designed architecture, like by Gropius or by people that we look at from the usual design perspective, but really all kinds of architecture, vernacular architecture, and I think commercial architecture is a big closer look at. So much that he's going to look at the archives of Siemens this summer, which has graciously opened up its archives for him to look at. It's kind of surprising and amazing that this can happen. So he's really working in a highly unusual realm because he's not favoring the aesthetic choices of the past, the way architectural history has been created, but really looking at all kinds of architectural construction in a deep social and political way. Last but not least, Paul followed me as the president of the College Art Association, the organization of artists and art historians in the United States. We now are international. We're going to look a little international. And from 2008 to 2010, the 2 worst years to be CAA president because it was during the recession downturn we had to deal with. What on earth to do with that? He was a fabulous president. He deserves accolades just for that alone. But he came out of that and kept doing research. Who would have thunk it? So, Paul, I want to welcome you to Amherst College.
Oh, thank you, Nicola, for that generous introduction, as always. And my thanks to my friends at Hampshire. We had a lovely discussion this morning around some of the historiography on Auschwitz, and my thanks, of course, to Amherst for bringing me here this afternoon. Few subjects may be less suitable to the aesthetic and intellectual currents of art historical debate, I think we can safely say, than the vernacular architecture of the SS concentration camp at Auschwitz. While the camp has had an obvious central position in historical studies, it is with rare exceptions rated no more than a mention in art history as a backdrop to post-war memorialization And in that regard, this architecture, the architectural environment of the camp, while this has, of course, been very well studied by historians, this is much more likely to show up in art history. That is, Albert Kahn's Dodge half-ton truck plant. Both of them are industrial facilities. Both of them were producing very actively during the war, but nevertheless, one is achieving a kind of status within art history, while the other one is, as I say, almost completely absent. And yet, the archive of the camp's architectural office is one of the largest depositories of evidence we have of any single architectural firm in the Nazi state. It is gigantic. What can art history bring to this massive record of the camp and urban planning at the site, encompassing well over 1,000 buildings? My project uses art historical tools to analyze comprehensively the construction of the politically charged but relatively visually banal institutional environment. The intersection of the cultural priorities of the SS, the organization of forced labor for construction, and the intertwined goals of racist genocide and imperialist military expansion in the East have yet to be systematically and comprehensively explored. New construction, particularly after spring of 1943, and I want to insist on that particular date, new construction, particularly after spring of 43, helped to control the victims and destroy them in the process of sustaining the militarized economy and the urban complex of which the inmate spaces were one part. Attending to the art historical subjects of design and construction, thus, helps clarify this complicated dynamic of one of the most significant building sites of the 20th century. In this sense, I want to argue that it further reveals how art historical questions concerning vernacular architecture, well beyond canonical forms, have explanatory power for investigating the intersection of ideological goals and political economic conditions for this most extreme society in human history. Now, looking at both the archival record as well as the digital visualizations of the design and the construction of the space, my presentation seeks to ask what these varied urban spaces and structures tell us about the perpetrators and their goals, as well as the victims and their experiences. While I begin with a general assessment of Auschwitz in architectural and ideological terms, I want to focus my discussion, as I mentioned, particularly on this relatively little analyzed period after the spring of 1943. That is up to the moment in the spring of 44 when the very large transport of Hungarian Jews was brought in to be murdered. Much of Auschwitz-Birkenau and other key sites of the Auschwitz environment were vast construction zones at this time. Building activity shifted from the long-term goals of constructing an SS ideal environment, as they would have envisioned it, to the short-term needs of the military economy. And that shift would have amazingly important ramifications both for the built environment as well as for the lives of those inmates, at least some of which were not chosen immediately to go to their death. The visualization of architectural plans related to Auschwitz, changes in its urban design, as well as built SS structures, helps us to investigate the spatial relationships, cultural values, and political realities as they developed in this crucial period. Now, importantly for Auschwitz, the public and private territorial realms of activity of victim and perpetrator, male and female, powerful and powerless, are some of the many subjects of overlapping concern. These overlaps point to a dynamic spatial environment, and that, again, the dynamic quality is what I really want to emphasize here, a dynamic spatial environment with a variety of different functions going on in this very large space. Now, historiographically, of course, one would be hard-pressed to find a different SS camp that has more written on it than Auschwitz. And indeed, the architecture of Auschwitz has itself also achieved some focus in the historical literature. Most importantly, German scholars such as Sybil Steinbacher has done a systematic analysis of the development of the camp. In terms of urban planning, Niels Gutschau, also a German historian, art historian, has focused on the development of some of the urban plan. And then in the English language, the canonically important work of Deborah Dvork and Robert Jan van Pelt have really analyzed this site and even its architectural office in many of its important areas. Nevertheless, all of these studies stop in 1943. And they stop in 1943 in terms of the architectural environment because that was the moment in which, in March of 43, they finalized the first of the gas chambers. That is, the majority of architectural analysis of Auschwitz has focused on that moment of genocide, but it has then stopped and it has ignored the larger extension of how that genocidal project, as well as the military drive, happened at the same time after spring of 43. So that's really this moment that I want to try to recover for us here. In that sense, I want to see the way that art historical questions will help us really to get at this moment, and get at this moment from a variety of different perspectives. Perspectives that emphasize the cultural ambitions of the SS, the political need, as they saw it, of killing, and also, of course, the military need of expanding that economy. Just briefly how I will go to look at this question and this intersection that I'm arguing is here in the camp is I want to start out the first part of my talk very broadly with the kind of cultural world of the SS, bring you into the development of the SS control over the concentration camp empire. And then the second part of my talk, I want to narrow it down to the very specific environment of Auschwitz and to talk about this moment of construction activity in 43, 44. And then the last part of the talk, I want to expand it out again to ask what does the analysis of Auschwitz tell us about a much broader view of the SS concentration camp system as a whole. In this sense, I'm really going to be thinking about the question of scale, something we talked about at Hampshire College this morning. And the question of scale is very important to me and to my colleague Ann Knowles because we're really talking about at least two different scales. The scale of the system, that is the SS scale of the camps as a whole. Here you see that these are main camps here. There's Auschwitz, and each line represents a connection to a sub-camp. I'll talk about this map a little bit later. So we'll talk about the system as a whole, but then we also, of course, want the very intimate scale of the body, that is the scale of the victim, to try to see an integrated history between the experience of the victims of Auschwitz, but also this broader scale of the SS ambition, particularly as it moved into the East and supported the military drive. So keeping these scalar factors in perspective will help us to go from that broader view of the SS to the specific view of Auschwitz, and then again to what broader conclusions we can have for this moment in the development of the Nazi state. Well, where to begin? A very unusual place to begin, but one that I think is quite important. We need to start wondering, or start our questions about the SS by looking at the Nazi state as a whole. And certainly one of the first things we need to realize is the importance of architecture to the Nazi state, coming from Hitler himself. Hitler styled himself as an architect, and indeed this particular design was presented to him on his birthday in 1940 as a kind of present. And it marked this, this moment of the redesign of Berlin that Albert Speer, his main architect, was in control of. So it just shows you that even in the war years, the war started in 39, architecture was still a very, very important goal for the state. It was important enough that even by 42, that is 3 years into the war, they were transferring railroad cars that they could have been using for industrial facilities, they could have been using them for troop movement, and instead they were using them to carry stone to Berlin for this project. So it shows you that they didn't see culture as separate from the military and political ambitions of the state. Indeed, culture, as it related to architecture, was central to those ambitions. Now, one might say, when one gets to the SS and the world of the concentration camp, this is really another part of the state. Hitler might very well have wanted to rebuild Berlin, but that's something very different than the brutal facility, for example, at Dachau. Here you see the original plan of Dachau. It was actually a factory site that they took over. And you see those pavilion structures arranged in a linear fashion, very, very typical of industrial architecture or of institutional architecture. But this was also, of course, as another institution, the SS favored this kind of form for its early camps. When we see that, we think, well, this was about a functional space. They threw a barbed wire around that, put some inmates in there, they're done. That's a concentration camp. But while this, of course, the functional element of the pavilions and the arrangement in the symmetrical form was always crucial to control, which after all is part of the camp, The SS also very quickly began to add other interests, other uses of this site. Particularly, once the SS took over the whole camp system in 1936, they reorganized all the concentration camps, and they rebuilt them along the Dachau model. And so that's when you get other camps, subsequently more famous, such as Buchenwald, also the camp of Flossenbürg, which opened in 1938. Buchenwald opens in 1937. But one of the things you start to see is that the SS started to take an interest in the architectural expression. We know, for example, from the record of Oswald Pohl, who was the head of the economic division of the SS, that he was very interested in the form of this building. The original design he rejected because it wasn't monumental enough. It didn't have enough of a kind of presence for the SS hierarchy. The interest pavilion there became a sign of the hierarchical interest of the SS in relationship to those pavilion barracks, which were very unadorned for the inmates themselves. But it went further than that. By the war years, the SS began to see its relationship to these cultural ambitions of the state. So much so that the camp of Mauthausen, for example, with these massive stone walls, it's about 30 feet tall. These massive stone walls were built from a forced labor quarry, a quarry set up to make stone for those very projects of Nuremberg and Berlin. So that the aesthetic criteria of the state became part of the way that you were punished, often punished to death. The average survival rate in Mauthausen in 1940 was 3 months. So sometimes worked to death, and it also became simultaneously part of the symbolic world of the SS. So cultural factors, political factors, and factors of oppression. All of these things were together in the concentration camp world even before we see the war and the expansion in the East. This was so much the case that Himmler himself started to talk about his own cultural ambitions. We might think about those walls of Mauthausen and compare them, for example, to a medieval town. Certainly there's a kind of medievalizing wall here. They actually even have turrets. I didn't show you a detail, but it's very much a kind of medievalizing architecture. And in that regard, this is a very revealing slide, because what you see here is Himmler laying a wreath on the grave of Henry I, Heinrich I, the first Ottonian emperor, who was buried in this chapel, this cathedral of Quedlinburg in central Germany. Himmler thought that this was so important to connect his world of the SS, a world of knights, essentially, modern knights, to this medieval past, that not only did he honor Henry I, but he also bought the cathedral and much of the town of Quedlinburg. So this belonged to the SS, for those medievalists in the crowd, until 1945. So they're really, again, the point I'm trying to make here is that this was not merely a policing force, but they saw policing and regulating and separating people out of Germany from their own ideological ambition that relates to this kind of medievalizing present of the SS in the East. We should always remember that the Ottonians, the way the SS saw them, were as defenders of the old German Reich against the Eastern hordes, right? That's the Slavs and the Huns. So that old message of history was re-instrumentalized by the SS to legitimize their own incursions and expansions into the East. A tower of Flossenbürg, and again, just note the use of stone there. So but at any rate, so that's the larger context. That's the big picture of the SS that establishes the general context that we've known for some time now. But what does that have to do about Auschwitz? Auschwitz is clearly, it's not a stone quarry camp. It is both a labor camp and then becomes a death camp. And then how do we talk about those cultural ambitions in relationship to this expansion of camp policy? This is a map that is quite well known, at least in terms of its general layout. You're seeing all the main camps, and then there's sub-camps here. And this comes from a data set that was provided to us by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. But it illustrates what is very well known in terms of the expansion of the concentration camp system through 1945. So you see also expansion into the eastern territories controlled by the German military drive. And then Auschwitz, which is right there. So I just wanted to give us a kind of sense of the system as a whole, and then Auschwitz right there. So when we go to Auschwitz, we're certainly talking about something that is part of a much greater system, but we're also talking about something that is quite particular. as I mentioned, it's the only camp, for example, that's both a labor camp and a death camp. So that really, that particularity has much to do with its development over the years. Now, it wasn't always that way. The site itself, which you see here, is the original plan. The site itself, like Dachau, was taken over from another architectural monument at the time. This part of the camp, which is what becomes known as Auschwitz I, there were 3 camps at Auschwitz, Auschwitz I here. This was a camp for displaced persons during the First World War. So these were people that were caught up in the conflict and part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at this time, and these were temporary housing for them. At the same time, there was a tobacco factory, which is right up here, that had its headquarters. After World War I, this became a site also for the Polish military. And then after September of '39, World War II, once the Germans took it over, they also took over this site. The SS quickly controlled the site by early 1940. And it was here that they decided to build their first concentration camp in the Polish zone. Now, originally, the camp was merely going to be a transit camp. They were going to build a relatively small camp that would be seen as some place to gather, particularly dissidents. At that time, that's what they were thinking about, from the West and move them east. That was the idea. But very quickly, it began to change in its focus. By January of 1941, the SS was beginning to expand its own economic operations beyond building materials to something much more connected with the wartime economy. And it was in January of '41 that Himmler, in particular, began dealing with IG Farben, the major chemical factory in Germany, or chemical conglomerate in Germany, to build a major synthetic rubber site at what became then Auschwitz III, as it was called. Birkenau was Auschwitz II. And what did they need for this major factory site? And this was going to produce synthetic rubber that was really going to sustain the war effort. Well, what they needed was a site for labor. And so Himmler, in March of 1941, says, we need to have at this place enough room for 100,000 people to be forced labor for this new factory complex. That's what the famous plan of Birkenau is about. This is all of those barracks, and this is meant to be the kind of ideal state. It was never quite completed in this way. But all these barracks were meant to serve that particular economic interest of exploiting forced labor, at this point, particularly Jewish forced labor, for this economic works. It was also, though, at the end of '41, so exactly as they're developing this plan, as at the end of '41, when they decide to move or to double that function and also make it a site of genocide. So we know we have plans dated November of 1941 that show the crematorium. So we know that exactly at the time that they were finalizing the plan for Birkenau, they were also finalizing the plan for the gas chambers, which were here, 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 and here. And you see the telltale double axis of Birkenau. On the one hand, you have one axis, which was for victims, which would bring them in and separate them out, those that were going to their death, those that were going to be forced labor. And on the other hand, you had the axis which led to the SS headquarters, that is the estate, which is where the SS guards lived and the subcommandant lived at that site. So you have 2 axes, one that represents SS power, that is symbolic power, the other that represents SS power over individuals. Both of those axes are important for organizing the spaces of Auschwitz. So at any rate, a very functional space, a space that seems to be very, very much about both industrial killing and forced labor, and a space that has very few large-scale buildings. This perhaps, of course, the most famous of them, the entrance pavilion, which is right there on the plan. So, but just one of many spaces. Needless to say, though, there were other spaces of Auschwitz and Birkenau, this whole environment, that were also important to the SS. In particular, I'm showing you in November 1942, this was the last major SS plan for Auschwitz I. So that's this, you could see these spaces of Auschwitz I are down here. These were inmate spaces there. And what I'm particularly interested in is this space here and this space over here. You see a kind of flowing street that curves gently there, series of single-family homes that face onto a kind of pastoral garden setting. These were the spaces of the residence of the SS guards. These were the spaces of the single-family homes and officers' quarters of the SS. There's a kindergarten there. There are a bunch of stables to ride horses over there. What's the point of this particular image? What we see here is the simultaneity of function that the SS itself was incorporating into its planning. You see the main camp of Auschwitz I, for example, the economic, the spine of which runs around, it's around an electric corridor, so that's why you have a spine of forced labor firms here, the Krupp's work up there. But then you also have the residential world of the SS. This was a world not of horror and oppression, it was a world of pleasure. This was a world they wanted to build. This is a world they wanted to live in. This is a world that had political ambitions and cultural ambitions simultaneously, as it is marked in their own architectural designs. That brought us to our particular collaborative, this Holocaust Geography Collaborative that Nicola mentioned. And we really wanted to kind of tackle this site, particularly in relationship to these different kinds of worlds that the SS was envisioning, and also where was we really wanted to recapture the world of the Jewish inmates, that is, particularly the forced laborers at that site, those few that survived at least for some months. Now, the collaborative began as a series of geographers who work on GIS, that is, they're computer scientists who do digital mapping, but they knew nothing about the Holocaust. And then the other half of us, people like me and Tim Cole and Simon Gigliotti, we were historians that worked on spatial aspects of the Holocaust. And because I did building, I was asked to be part of this collaborative. Now, very quickly, we broke off into subgroups and into case studies. And Anne and I, we worked on 2 case studies. Anne was the lead researcher for the camp system case study. And so I was the kind of second author of this one. And then I was the main researcher for the Auschwitz case study, and she was the second author for that one. And so already you can see as we set up this project, we were working at 2 different scales. We were working at the scale of the system, and then we were working at the scale of the individual environment. Especially important for us was at the individual environment, as we thought we were looking at questions of visibility and invisibility. Because we thought that would be the question that would link the world of the SS, the world of surveillance, with the world of experience. Did you have a moment of privacy at Auschwitz if you were a victim, ever? Was there a moment in which you were invisible? So these were questions we were trying to see, and we thought we would do it by recreating the environment of Auschwitz through both a 2D environment, which is all the buildings, but also a 3D reconstruction, which we could then use to map testimony in many ways. Now, that sent me into the archive, and this is where I discovered, much to my surprise, that the archive did not only include this. These are very well-known plans. These are the 2 plans for the crematorium and gas chambers of Auschwitz. Here you see the second set of crematorium and gas chambers. This was the first set over here. Both by well-known architect. Jaskot went right from Auschwitz into a practice in Vienna after the war. No problems whatsoever, continued working as an architect until at least the early 70s. But what you see here is also very clean plans, and this is what architects and art historians have been looking at before. What I didn't expect was this. Instead of seeing clean plans, I saw some of those. I saw thousands and thousands and thousands of messy plans, plans that were really very unclear. What I'm showing you here is this is one of the last plans for Auschwitz as they thought they were finished in February of '43. And I've circled here, you see these drawn parts. This is a lazaret, or a field hospital for the SS. This was added in January '44 by hand. And if you see these faint lines here, those faint lines are actually the ideal plan as it was projected into the future. So that was the faint lines are the traces of that plan I showed you earlier with the housing estate. So essentially what the important point of this slide is you have 3 different temporal scales in the same architectural drawing. You have the ideal world of the future, you have the immediate need of the present, and then you have the marks of 1943. So you have 3 different times, this is not a plan that the SS kind of used and put away. It was a plan they were constantly changing. And this is just one of thousands that look like this, of people that were drawing and then overdrawing. And I suddenly thought, well, how are we going to map that? How are we going to stabilize that? And of course, Anne, teaching me all about GIS, immediately thought of the concept of mapping layers. Of course, you could do layers over time. And so the temporal scale, that is the idea of change, not the flat plan of the built environment, that is the plan of the city, but the plan of the city as it changes over time, started to become very important to us in our research, and it became more important for that, explaining that built environment. Now, what that meant is, so as I was doing the archival work and we were going around, we started to build a data set that included all the information we could of every building we could find. I like to show this slide because it's often something that is very important for digital humanities to remember, is the digital humanities is a lot of this, that is holes. I don't know, and I don't believe anybody can find every date of every building at Auschwitz. It does not exist. What exists is some buildings where we have a start and an end date, some buildings where we have an approximate date, and some buildings where we have to make our best guess. That is, it shows you not this world of pristine data, it shows you the work of humanists. That is the work of interpretation based on the best evidence we have. So digital humanities, much to some of its, or the opposite of what some of its detractors would say, is actually very much about a humanist tradition, not merely putting historical information into a kind of format to which it doesn't belong. At any rate, this is one of the things we came up with. This is Chester Harvey's map, another of our coworkers. And you could see one of the things we're trying to do is to identify each one of the buildings. Each one of those has a number. And you see three different colors here. The three different color schemes represent buildings we know absolutely the date, buildings we know approximately the date, and buildings we're really using contextual information to make our best guess at the date. And so you see a variety of different forms here. We have a little bit more clarity of Birkenau because the architectural evidence of Birkenau is much more precise in terms of when buildings were done and at what time. At any rate, while we were working on the Auschwitz project, Anne was also developing the camps system project. And I have to say, at first, I was a little more skeptical about this half of our work, because I thought, while we really were coming across new information on Auschwitz, new information about this changing built environment, some of the early mapping projects weren't really telling us things that surprised me. So for example, this map, while I was surprised by this strange line of Sachsenhausen which goes into Eastern Europe, or look at the spread of Sachsenhausen down here. So Sachsenhausen, that did surprise me. These are sub-camps of this camp outside of Berlin. Look at the spread there, or this one that flies off from Stutthof, or the way that Auschwitz, the subcamps turn in as opposed to east. That is, they're turning west towards the Reich, not east towards the military drive. So there were some surprising elements of that. But nevertheless, I thought that this was really illustrating, it was a good illustration, but it was an illustration of the camp system as we had already come to know it in some important ways by Holocaust historians in the past. But nevertheless, so we kept pushing those questions as well. I want to give you that sense of the simultaneous here. In the meantime, in the archive, I was coming across a lot of this, which were very strange buildings that no one ever talks about. That is the vernacular environment of Auschwitz. Those other thousands of buildings. Because once we started seeing those dots on the map, I started saying, well, what are all those dots? Well, one of them, for example, is this. This is a sauna. It's a troop sauna. It's where you go after, grotesquely enough, a very long day of work. This is where you would relax. But I didn't only find this building, which has a kind of Central European carpentry, forced labor, of course. But I started to find things like this. That is site plans for this sauna. That sauna is right there. They built another one there. And as you can see, it's right next to troop barracks. And there's the commandant's house. This is Auschwitz I right there. But you can also see it's about 50 yards from the crematorium of Auschwitz I. You could see it. And what really started to interest us is this confusion of functions at the site. This was not the order that was described in terms of the literature on the SS. This was building administrators, living, relaxing, death, forced labor, food supply, all in the same zone. This was not all divided out in some functional way in which it was efficiently laid out. There was something different going on there, and I think that was the moment of 43. We started to see that maybe visibility and visibility wasn't our first question. Maybe it was about these variety of different functions, this chaos of the environment in terms of its use that was the architectural story of Auschwitz. In the meantime, Chester in particular was developing some 3D models because we were still thinking about a visibility and visibility study. We needed to have very, very precise models of all the buildings. We started to do broader maps about the functional distribution of the site. And from that really came a real interest in thinking about different ways that the site might be used and at different times. But as Chester developed this, he also asked me to give him some time signatures, that is, as precise as I could, of start and end dates of buildings. And I'm like, well, that's good. I'm an historian, I like that. And then he put it into a very simple animation. And he showed it to me in a room, and I'm sorry, I'm just giving you a slide shot of that animation, the beginning of that animation. And this is when I really thought, that now we're seeing something different. Because with this initial animation, and I'm just going to explain it to you, I'm sorry, I'm not going to show it to you, but it showed the building as it changed over time. These were the buildings that were in construction, the light pink, in April 1st of 1943. If it was dark red, they were finished. And what this essentially showed us as he ran that animation was that Auschwitz was not about design. Auschwitz was not about the use of a finished building. Auschwitz was about this, a constantly changing, fluid environment of construction. It was the fluidity of the space that showed up in the animation. It was the ambiguity of one day there's a pile of bricks that you can hide behind, the next day it's gone. It was that kind of constant change that really surprised me. And what we began to realize is that the story of architecture wasn't in the architecture's office. It was on the building site, and it was at a particular time. This is, you see 3 slides of the animation. So there's December, February, and April, so 43 to 44. And you can see the buildings as they change over time. And it was the chaos of the environment of Auschwitz, which was really the story of its architecture. That led us back into the archive and led us to realize that not only did you have over 300 architects working at this time at Auschwitz, that's a very large building office. 150 of them were forced labor architects. But you also had, exactly in this period, 10,000 forced laborers a day who were doing nothing more than building. That was something I'd never looked for when I was looking at this question of design. So it's only when we started to visualize this that I took my mind away, and the team took its mind away from the famous buildings, which are these well-analyzed structures, which you see just here. It's just one little square. We took our mind away from the design of the building to this overall environment of construction. That was also an important moment because it began to clarify for us, we think, a very important point that is raised in the historiography but has never been explained. And that is to say, 2/3 of all escape attempts in Auschwitz occurred between June of 1943 and April of 1944. So Auschwitz was opened in 1940, was closed in January of 45. 2/3 of all escape attempts occurred in a very narrow window. Scholars have known that for years. No one has ever said why. Why is because probably this. That is, here you see the 3D environment. And every building in red was a building that was under construction in that period. So as you can see, and this is only partial reconstruction. We haven't yet completed the research on this part of the camp. So what you see here is an environment that was visually active, that was constantly changing, and that would provide for a possibility of escape. But at the same time, we shouldn't be romantic about this. It also provided for the possibility that you were caught. That is the unpredictability of this environment. It was one of the deadliest periods at Auschwitz as well. So thinking about construction as a separate component of this process. So separate from design, separate from signification of reception, thinking of construction as a separate component became an important way of recovering this moment and explaining this environment for victims and perpetrators alike. This is my favorite map, I think, of the whole project. This is a daily map of building changes at Auschwitz during this period. And of course, what's interesting is the ups and downs, the spikes and the troughs. This was what Auschwitz was. Auschwitz was about this changing zone. But it was a changing zone mostly in this period. It wasn't as active in building in 1941, and the building had predominantly stopped by summer of 44, at least not to this degree. So it was a very specific moment that we were able to capture through this visualization process. But of course then, we have the other question of the camp system as a whole. Now, as Anne and I were working on this, one of the things we definitely wanted to show was the development of armaments camps. Very famously, after the defeat at Stalingrad, so it's the spring of 1943, Goebbels calls for total war. It was at this point when the SS finally shut down some of those stone quarries. They really had their mind set on that other business. They shut down some of those stone quarries, and under the aegis of Albert Speer, they turned the whole concentration camp forced labor environment to the production of armaments for the war effort. And many, many historians have talked about this moment. This is the moment of Messerschmitt. This is the moment of Krupp's. This is the moment of Siemens. That is the moment when large-scale German industry, who has already been using forced labor, but now they've also got the concentration camp forced labor brought in. Dora Mittelbau and the construction of rockets there, for example. 6,000 people died. So it's that kind of level of turn towards armaments that we're talking about. And this is one of the first visualizations that Anne produced. And you can see it quite clearly, the red being the armaments camp, and you can see that spike right there. So 43, you've got some showing up, but it's particularly in 44 when these camps really get rolling. But we'd already been asking at the scale of the individual, what about construction at Auschwitz? And it's at that point when Anne and I started to say, well, what about construction in the camp system? So what we did is we went back, and with the help of her students, I have to say, we went back and we tagged every single camp. So we're talking about 1,100 camps. And we tagged them in terms of the actual work that prisoners were doing as far as we could tell. So there's the planned work. I'm building a factory for Krupp's. But that factory sometimes was never finished. Sometimes, as we know, a factory takes a long time to build. Well, if you open up, if you start building in 44 and the war's over in 45, did they actually do armaments work? Or was their work actually something else, that is construction? And when we started to tag the camps for this particular topic, Anne produced this map that, again, really surprised me. What you're seeing here is a map of all the camps and subcamps in which the labor is known, and we only know about 900 of them. Some of these camps are very small, they show up very quickly, and so there's really no record. Or there isn't a record yet, I should say. So there's about 900 camps here, and what surprised us is not, of course, the number of armaments camps, but the number of camps in which construction was the main activity of the camp for its entire existence. And what this says to me is that the majority of the literature on Nazi Germany, which talks about forced labor in relationship to armaments, is talking about a literature from the point of view of the perpetrator. That's certainly what they intended. And it's certainly what some of the camps were used for. But looking at the camps from the perspective of the labor, the prisoners, you're looking at a camp of construction. And that construction story had been lost because we'd been looking at it from what was the end goal of the site, not what was actually done at the site. Working on construction at Auschwitz is what brought us to the question of construction in the camp system as a whole. We hadn't asked that question when we started. We weren't thinking about that question at all. It's only when we started to think about construction and the built environment in the detailed micro scale of Auschwitz that it became the macro scale of the system. Now, of course, we're still missing a very important piece, and that goes back to our initial question of visibility and invisibility. And so the next stage of this project is really going towards looking at trying to incorporate some of the survivor narratives into the project, and we're going to be using the USC Shoah Foundation, which has 50,000 plus testimonials. Already there's been some digital work on this. Todd Presler, a very, very interesting man at UCLA, has mapped the index, for example, which is these large blobs here, are clusters of terms that show up in the testimonies of the survivors. So trying to see what are the themes, trying to pull that out of the index. Certainly one of the most surprises of our initial work in this area is that construction work in the testimonies is hiding in plain sight. That is to say, once we started listening to testimonies, it was unbelievable how many we would come across in which someone would say, oh, well, yes, I had to carry bricks for a week, or I had to move cement sacks for a month. They rarely showed up in the index. They only showed up in the testimony. So it was something that wasn't yet marked, or at least marked in a significant way. Just one example is this man, Boleslav Brodecki, who was a Hungarian Jew. He was brought in 1943, and he was very much someone who was, has a very rich story to tell, and I encourage you to go. You can see this actually online. It's one of their freely available testimonies. And he talks about his work, but what's really interesting is he talks about the spaces of his work. He talks about the way that spaces were so important to his experience. Not only his arrival and being sent here or being told to go there, but also about where he was beaten, where he had a good experience. But he doesn't really know those spaces. I mean, he says, I was at this hut and I was beaten there. I remember meeting some friends near the entrance of the camp. You can't map that because he doesn't remember that exactness of the space. But you can start to see relationships between the kind of mapping world of the SS as well as the experienced world of the survivor. That is, they exist topologically in a spatial relationship. And they're not the same, and of course they're not one-to-one. But what they do exist in space. And that, to me, I believe, promises a great hope for expanding spatial analysis in the Holocaust and actually incorporating survivors' testimonies into a much richer understanding of the way that the built environment played an important role in both the survival but also the oppression of many thousands of people. Well, where does that leave us? In some ways, it is a specific story very much to Auschwitz, and seeing the significance of construction at Auschwitz and in the camp system as a whole did not, though, happen merely, or seeing that significance didn't happen through merely looking at the archive, much as I am an archive rat and believe in the importance of the archive. It also happened through the process of the digital visualization. And I think that this really offers us, through collaborative work, it offers us the possibility to get to a much more total understanding of the Holocaust from a variety of different perspectives, or to use Saul Friedlander's words, an integrated history of this particular moment in time. In that sense, you need both. You need both the tools of the historian, such as digital visualization, the geographer, but you also need the approach of the art historian, someone who's attentive to the built environment. And we have to start thinking at different scales and at different kinds of art historical questions. We can't merely think about the question of individual buildings. We have to start thinking of questions of a relationship of thousands of buildings in space. That's different than saying the plan, right? I'm not talking about the plan. I'm talking about the relationship between buildings and space. So we need to start using buildings like this as part of our analysis. Instead of looking Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill's single skyscrapers after the war, very famous, they're a very famous architectural firm, we need to start looking at their plans for Oak Ridge, Tennessee, as Jean-Louis Cohen argues in his very important book, Architecture in Uniform. That is to say, I think we can start saying there are different kinds of art historical questions that we can ask if we start focusing on questions like construction, and we don't limit ourselves to merely questions of design. Now, more broadly for Holocaust studies, I would argue the essential spatial characteristic of Auschwitz in terms of its massive scale, but also in the regulation of spaces for victims and perpetrators alike, indicate a distinct kind of function for the camp in relationship to these Nazi goals. A key function was obviously ridding the empire of racial and political undesirables, something that was part of the military drive east. Another key function was obviously to gear forced labor to economic production of not only synthetic rubber, but other things like agricultural production to feed the army. So that was another kind of short-term goals. But another one was also very much to build a cultural environment. In the short term and at the micro scale, this plan, after all, had to be constructed. And what that meant is you needed cultural actors there, architects and designers who were part of this process that could organize the labor and think about it in terms of the functional needs of the SS and the state. Focusing, therefore, on forgotten structures, vernacular environments, and the thousands of buildings rather than the single design, in some ways is focusing on the process of building, and the process of building leads us to the visualizations that help us come to a more total understanding. In that sense, I would say that it is including cultural questions that lead us to this total understanding, and it helps us to a greater clarity on the genocide and the development of the regime, a greater clarity that certainly shows how building and the analysis of building can help us to understand the Holocaust. Thank you. Go for it.
You use the word chaos, which is really interesting, which implies no planning whatsoever, serendipity, I guess, almost, in terms of planning. And secondly, construction. So I'm curious, how chaotic was it? And was it a willful chaos? And secondly, what were they constructing? They're constructing, you said they're doing nothing but constructing buildings, moving cement and everything. Were they constructing these little utopias, these SS utopias? Is that what they were doing?
So two questions. And chaos, that's a word I would probably back off of now. Because for those who know Nazi studies, it also signals Behemoth, Neumann's very famous book about the kind of chaotic organization of the Nazi state. Because certainly, there was organization and order. Like any organization and order, it was never perfect and it was never total. So that's different than chaos, right? But while I'm having just backed off from that, I'm going to back right back into it, because it does seem to me that from the victim's point of view, you were experiencing chaos. You were experiencing disorder. You were experiencing even rules and regulations that you didn't know why. So it is the important problem, for example, of when survivors misremember or they remember the wrong thing. What does that mean? It doesn't mean they remember the wrong thing. It means the SS did not tell them, well, here's the plan and this is what we're going to do. It means they only had partial information, always. So for them, that meant that at times, and in this environment, I would probably argue, at times it was indeed a chaotic experience, if not a chaotic environment. So a chaotic experience. So that's where I will keep with the word chaos. But getting to your larger question on that, they were shifting the building project at certain parts of the camp on an almost daily level. And it's really the micro changes they were making from day to day based on the weather, based on a new order from Berlin, based on a new situation developing on the front, based on the availability of labor. So you were just as likely to be sent to go harvest a potato crop as you were to be sent to carry sacks of cement. So all of these priorities had to be constantly rejiggered and reapportioned for this system, which meant that while they had a goal they were working towards architecturally in terms of the built environment, it was a goal that constantly had to be adaptive at the same time. So, and that's the kind of dynamic I would want to preserve, is the idea of working towards a goal as well as flexibility. These two terms together.
So were they constantly
No. These buildings by 44, they're done. So all those red squares are done in
So
44.
what were they constructing?
They were constructing, a lot of entertainment facilities were going up. There was a hotel that was going up in 44. They were worried about the plans for where Himmler was going to stay in that hotel. There was housing. Much of the housing, if any of you have visited Auschwitz-Birkenau, if you walk from the train station, much of the housing you see was housing for the troops, always a problem, officer housing. They were constructing also, the Krupp's work was always being constructed that whole time, although it was also producing armaments. So it was a whole variety of things, but building was getting done. But what's interesting is the way it shifts around the geography of the site.
Your collaborator Ann Knowles was out here about, it was 2 years ago over at Smith, and I thought I remembered that she had, like, maybe, I don't know if it was SketchUp or some other way that it was a 3D model of the camps. But we didn't see any of that, but can you speak to other aspects that?
Oh, I think we did. I think I went over it relatively
Was
quickly.
it the aerial view of the little red houses?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And so that's why it just looks so big, 'cause we're so far out.
Yeah.
Well, I find this really interesting because if you take, say, a survivor memoir and you're reading it in class with the students, right? Then you can say, and you can talk about the physicality of the camp and say, well, this is the area they're talking about, and kind of immerse yourself in that area.
And I think that's actually absolutely right. And certainly this is where you can start to put testimonies, you can start to map testimony. The problem is, though, those red buildings. So you've got to ask which day is your testimony, because sometime that is going to be half a structure. And
so is there a time element that you could
not on the 3D, yeah. So no, the time element is that graph. That's the one we have. And that's just a computer science problem. But it's also a problem of specificity. I can't tell you when this building was halfway done. I can tell you when it was started and when it was finished, but I can't tell you anything in between. So that's a spatial question. We could only do is estimate. But that is, what I also think is important is if you see, and we of course see them all the time, reconstructions of Auschwitz and maps of Auschwitz, I would ask you to say, every time you see that, say when. Because what you're seeing is not a map of Auschwitz. You're seeing a map of Auschwitz at a very specific time. And that's a mistake made all the time. People say, here's Auschwitz. Well, when is Auschwitz? And that's where the building process is part of this question, and the most important part of the question.
Following on to that, build a fly-through simulation where you could adjust the time. Would that help survivors perhaps solidify their memories of where they were?
Right. Certainly one of the most, I'll respond to that with an anecdote, one of the most intimidating things for any of us that work on the Holocaust is when we get into a room and we have many survivors or a survivor that shares his or her story. It's always very moving, a very important event. I was fortunate last year to be asked at the 1939 Club at UCLA, which is a kind of broad club, mostly of survivors that are supporting Holocaust studies there. And there were many, many survivors in the audience. I have to say the question and answer was not me answering much. It was them telling me about their experiences. What I was gratified about, though, was how many people in the audience said, I had to build too. And I didn't mention that on my testimony. So that it really did bring up experiences of, and I think that it sounds banal, but it's capturing their labor that is just written out of the record, and that seems to be an important ethical goal of what we can do by talking about this moment. And it did seem, at least for that group of survivors, it seemed to be an important moment for them to talk about something that they too were forced to do.
So what's interesting to me about all of this is that you're showing sort of architecturally things that historians have been talking about obviously quite a bit, which is all this construction that's going on in 1940, expansion 43, 44, that's when the German economy in some ways finally kind of really gets moving, gets to where it needs to be in order to prosecute the war. So what does that say about, Germany more broadly? I mean, it suggests that, the fact that all this construction reconstructions going on 43 and 44, it suggests the Nazis were not particularly well prepared for the war that they ended up having to fight, which is not the war that they wanted to fight.
Mhm.
So that's sort of intriguing to me. In other words, this tells us actually a lot about what's going on. And it's always striking in Primo Levi when he's got that line about, never an ounce of rubber was produced from, the factory. So
Farben,
you're
yeah.
absolutely right. It's all built all the time. So that's one sort of observation, question, whatever. What does this tell us, the fact that all this construction is going on? The other question is when you start talking about the hotel and the saunas and everything like that, I didn't hear you mention the word Germanization at all, and I don't know if that's, I think your earlier work does a fabulous job talking about how the SS projects, like all that stone, was really related to Germanization projects, throughout East Central Europe. So I wonder if you could say anything about that and how this work sort of builds on some of your earlier work too.
Sure, two very big questions, and I'll try to take them one at a time. The first one, in the sense of, I'm going to challenge and push back a little bit. I'd like you to show me those historians that are talking about construction all the time. Because what those historians, with the ones that so Adam Tooze, I love Adam Tooze's book, great book called The Wages of Destruction, which really shows you how the war economy, particularly the agricultural economy and the armaments economy, were both successful and unsuccessful exactly at this moment. Tooze absolutely talks about construction, but it's in a kind of passing thing. We're constructing for crops, and it needs that much steel, but it's actually not at the level of the actual built environment. That's not his interest. Florian Freund? No?
I'll come up with it.
Yeah, so.
Sorry.
But anyway, so I think that the, certainly construction activity has been part of the focus, but I think when most of what we talk about in forced labor, it's always teleological. It leads to that IG Farben work, it seems to me at least. And so I'm trying to kind of separate that out a little bit. So I think that, certainly this is not a surprise to historians, but I do think that it captures a different phase than we're used to talking about in that historical literature. It's a phase that is really, as I say, separate from that production of armament. So I think you need to separate those two, and that gives us a different sense of the development of the German economy as a whole. That would be at least my argument. You can push back on that if you like. But then, the Germanization. The Germanization is actually quite important to me in the broader scheme of what we're doing here, because I deal more with the craftsmanship of the buildings. A lot of the buildings done for the SS were like that carpentry work of the sauna. And it's absolutely a kind of Central European architectural traditions. It's an architectural vernacular that anybody from around Prague to Lvov would recognize. And exactly, this is a kind of architecture that the SS is taking on because this is now their architecture. So I think that is very much part of that Germanization effort. Niels Gutschau has done some really good work on this for the pre-43 project, so the big plans for the East. What I think is interesting is that post-43, they're still hammering away at we are going to Germanize the East. And we're going to do it because we're going to build an empire because empire has to be built. So I think that's part of the larger project, but I don't quite, I think it's techniques that are really important in that regard.
That's a clarifying question. It sounds like they're not Germanifying that architecture, they're absorbing what was there and claiming it as German, right?
Well, yeah, but
Because if it's
that's...
East Europeans,
Yeah.
I mean, that sauna reminded me of what houses in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
In the Dutch.
Yeah. So, they were selective about what they were appropriating. Meaning, for example, if you have a hipped roof and you've got a kind of angle cut out of the hipped roof, this is Central European. I mean, it just exists in all different kinds of ethnic contexts. The Germans would claim that's a particular kind of farming architecture. So, but they didn't claim everything was a farming architecture. Again, this is not my work. This is a work of many people. Wojciech Bowman, for example, has talked about the layout of farms. The Polish farm, which was not centralized but was more linear, was something that the Germans would reject, so as non-Germanic, always in quotation marks, of course.
So this is a question I'm sure you get a lot. The language of these digital images, these computer they seem to be anti-traumatic. And I'm just wondering, like, how do you feel personally about the kind of cleanliness of this project and the way it seems to remove the emotional and the traumatic, at least in the language or the vocabulary of these computer-generated images?
Two responses. One is that we have to visualize it, otherwise we couldn't see it. I could not have asked these questions unless I'd seen that animation. If I had not seen that animation, I would not be talking about construction today, I'd be talking about design. So the visualizations are very much about the need to explore this past. More importantly, though, and this is my own take on digital humanities, I think much too much of digital humanities work is about the end visualization, the end product. Look at the building I've reconstructed, look at the map I've done. I hope also one of the things I've tried to show, and that's why I became a little more autobiographical here, for us, this is a research process. This is not a finished map. This is not done. This is not complete. This is part of our working process, like showing you a document from the archive. I have one letter here. I don't have the response there. There's a gap. So this, I think in that regard, some of the strongest digital humanities work I've seen is exactly along that track. That is, thinking digitally is thinking about process, not thinking about the end result. I would say the end result is an historical interpretation of Auschwitz built environment. That's an art historical question, it's not a digital question. But digital thinking allows us to get to that art historical question. What I think we need to do when we start thinking in the digital realm is to say which questions are best answered by these particular kinds of procedures. But I do take your point. I don't have an answer for, I don't have a resolution to that yet. I think it is, though, something that, one of the reasons I always show the database is I want to show you the holes in the database. And indeed, I would argue that digital humanities sometimes makes you a better art historian. Because how many art historical, and my own work included, where there's the footnote that says, oh, the record is incomplete. That's one footnote. Oh, maybe you'll see it, maybe you won't. You cannot have a hole in a database if you're going to visualize it. You must make a decision, and you must talk about why you're making that decision. I have to say, why am I saying this building is completed in June of 1944 when I don't have a shred of documentation for it? Because it's contextual, and I'm making an interpretation. So the digital actually makes me more cognizant of my interpretive role in this particular materialist analysis.
Heather had a question.
I'm wondering about the perpetrator's experience of this environment, like the officers who are sitting in that sauna and possibly with the view of the crematorium. Have you incorporated maybe their oral history into this database?
There's definitely one step, and I don't know if it's this summer, probably some following summer. I want to do the trial testimony of Ertel. So the man, Fritz Ertel, who designed Birkenau, who was a Bauhaus architect, as many people know. He was actually put on trial in Vienna in 1972. He was another one of the architects that had a very successful career. No one asked him anything. So he designed Birkenau, but in 72, he was put up on for trial. That testimony is available, and I haven't looked at that testimony yet. It's not available in a digital, or you have to go to the archive. So I just haven't been to Vienna yet to see that. But that's definitely something I want to think about, because he had to talk about what he was doing and how he was feeling about it and all these things. By the way, he was let go. He was considered completely without guilt. So there you go. So that's one example, but there are the Auschwitz trials from the mid-60s, which have lots of testimony from the guards, which would also be an important story. Your question is also really good this week in particular, as some of you may know. One of the last SS officers at Auschwitz is now on trial in Germany as we speak, and he was a bookkeeper, so an accountant. But unlike many of the people that were members of the SS, he has been constantly talking about his guilt over that. So he doesn't actually he hasn't been trying to hide it, quite the opposite. He did get transferred to a military service. But there was someone who would also be very interesting to put into this particular project. It's a long way of saying I'm dodging it a little bit. because we got sidetracked on the construction question, we haven't gotten back down to the individual question. That's really got to come next. So I would agree.
How deep is the photographic and filmic archive, and how much do you use those in your analysis?
I don't know of any film, but there are over 10,000 photographs from Auschwitz. Now, many of those are photographs of just face shots, both of the SS and of the victims. So shots for your records. But new photographs are coming up every day. I was just told by the Holocaust Museum that they just got a collection of photographs that are construction workers at Auschwitz in '44. And I haven't seen them yet, but I'm looking very much forward to getting those. And I think that's about 150 photographs. Never before seen. They just happen to come in their collection. Or of course the Hooker album, very famously, that is online now through the photo archive of the Holocaust Museum, which shows the guards relaxing, including at one of those saunas. And there they are, smiling, having ice cream. I think photography is really good for us because it also, if used in some important ways, can show that this was for the SS a normal environment. It wasn't something unusual. It wasn't something outside of what they thought they were supposed to be doing.
Something that I think would be really interesting as a kind of next step in a project like this would be to show just a kind of average daily human traffic.
Yeah.
Since when you listen to testimonies, one of the really interesting things is what people did day to day, how far they had to go, and kind of who went where. And survival was based completely on where you ended up working. And so something that had some kind of traffic patterns, not of transportation arriving to the camp, but just of what the daily life of people was from what barrack they started with and where they had to go, I think would be really fascinating.
If I may pitch some of our other colleagues on that regard, Tim Cole and Alberto Giordano worked on a reconstruction of the Budapest ghetto. So the project as a whole takes the different spaces of the Holocaust. So the ghetto, the arrest, the moment of the death march, the moment of transit, the moment of the camp, the moment of the system. So different spatial scales. But what Alberto and Tim worked on was Budapest. And if you go to Stanford Spatial History Lab site where they're hosting some of our work, the Budapest Channel has an animation of how far you needed to walk to get to a hospital, how far you needed to walk to get to a market. The Budapest ghetto was not an enclosed ghetto, it was a ghetto by houses. So there were Jewish houses and non-Jewish houses. And for 2 or 3 hours during the afternoon, you were allowed out of your house to go shopping or take care of necessary requirements. Well, if you lived way out in the suburbs, you can't walk to the market that you're allowed to shop at in 2 hours. And so what they've done in a animation there is to show you individual trajectories. What were the possibilities of walking to the market, walking to the hospital, and other kinds of environments. So I recommend going to that site where they're trying to experiment with that temporal scale of the individual in space and in time. But you're right, it should be something that we could also start adding to this as well.
Where is that site?
The Stanford Spatial History Lab, which one of our collaborators is Eric Steiner, who is one of the most brilliant geographer visualizers I've ever met in my life. And he's worked on a whole series of projects, but he was anyhow, it's a great resource. But yeah, he works at the Stanford Spatial History Lab. Yes.
To return to design aesthetics, you mentioned how vernacular styles were being absorbed, but there were also historical allusions in the walls, for example. Was this all seat of the pants, or was there some coordination with larger Nazi official design?
Absolutely not seat of the pants. No, this was very much, if you read the Schwarze Chor, the SS Journal, which I wouldn't recommend it, but if you want to read it, you can. If you read the Schwarze Chor, it was quite clear that the SS was cornering 2 markets in architectural terms. Medieval and early German medieval, right? It's not High Gothic, it's definitely that German Romanesque, or Ottonian, I should say. So it's Ottonian, and it's also vernacular Eastern Europe. So those are the two, you would see photo essays, for example, on various housing estates. You'd see Himmler wrote a piece saying how glorious it is that Germany has recaptured Marienwerder and these other great cathedrals from the period. So Himmler himself, signed the article. So there was a very, very specific kind of ambition, and it was Eastern oriented, and it was about this kind of knightly past. Now, what's interesting about your question is, of course, well, that's not Goebbels. For Goebbels, it was modern. For Goebbels, it was streamlined. For Goebbels, it was also Roman Empire. Now, if you were Rosenberg, however, it was Greek, and it was classical, much more traditional. So within the Nazi Party itself, you had people staking out various positions. Why would they do this? Well, if the leader of your party has said his #1 peacetime initiative is architecture, if you want to get to his interests, you better have some architectural opinion, or you're not going to get to that table for that conversation. So I would argue, and no one's really talked about this, it was about that kind of competitive poker playing amongst the Nazi hierarchy themselves.
Chaos.
Organized chaos, right? Not completely chaotic. Oh, sorry. That's our. That's just. This is in CAD for those of you who know something about computer program. You can put a spotlight in CAD, which gives you the sense of what we call a view shed. So that spot is right there, and it shows you what you could see from that particular spot.
I wanted to ask about the whole section of buildings that are not red.
Oh, I'm sorry. The gray buildings. The gray. So it's yeah. Mm-hmm.
My sense is that at Bear Canal, there are a lot of foundations for more barracks.
Mm-hmm.
The barracks themselves were never built.
Mm-hmm.
Was the idea then that there would be that many more people there on a day-to-day basis eventually?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely, right. And it was not only, it's very, very rarely illustrated, but a man named Paul Wrawicki, who was a young Polish scholar who's done a kind of historical restoration of Birkenau, has done just some amazing work on more historical plans. Sorry, I want to go back here to this one. So this is what's called Mexico, which was the SS name for this particular zone. There was supposed to be an equal building up here. So there was actually, the whole plan was meant to be symmetric. So there was meant to be one axis here, one axis here. This was all meant to be finished. And as you can see, only part of it was finished. And then they were going to extend this part so that it would be absolutely symmetrical. And that was, that's the part that's hardly ever illustrated, because it was only a drawing board plan. But it was absolutely built. The last barracks, I think, was finished in October of 1944. So Soviets come January of 45, right? So they closed the building office in November of 44. Yeah.
You mentioned there were 100-odd forced architects.
150, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if we know anything about what they brought, or were they merely craftspeople, or what?
Much of their work is still available. Many designs, for example, will have, they always have the architect's name in the corner, the draftsman's. If you see a number, it's a forced labor architect. It's not a, so their names were never mentioned, they have a number. And just in my, and I have not worked through the entire Auschwitz archive yet, it's just really big. I'd say it's about 50-50 breaks down. And we do know some of their names. So we've got a few testimonies, which are good. We don't have all of their names. A lot of them exist only on paper as we need 50 architects. We used 100 today. So, but I think I think we can get to those people because many of them survived. Forced labor architecture was obviously a much better job because you're drawing inside and you get better rations. As easy as that.
Do you think they were required to follow a particular plan, or were they allowed to be creative at all?
That's a good question. I don't know, because they certainly, they certainly couldn't change the plan. But could they change the building? Could they suggest, for example, arrangement of a space or a different treatment? It's a good question. I'm not sure. I'd have to, yeah, it's a good question. I'll say maybe.
Well, thank you, Paul, so
Oh,
much.
good.
I'm sure it's really a good way to
Thank you. Great audience.